No one expected the mountain to answer after 40 years of silence. Yet in early 2025, as a team of geophysical researchers scanned the slopes of Durupınar with new generation imaging equipment, the ground itself seemed to exhale a secret it had been holding since antiquity. A massive shape, long, symmetrical, and impossibly structured, lit up on their screens. It was not a blur, not an artifact of the sensors, not a geological trick. It looked like architecture. It looked intentional, it looked familiar. But before the world could react, something strange happened. The story barely appeared in mainstream news. A few lines in regional papers, 2 short academic notes, and then silence. As if the discovery had been swallowed whole. As if no one wanted to talk about what had just emerged from beneath the Turkish earth. And maybe that is why this subject matters now more than ever. For decades, archaeologists, geologists, skeptics, and believers fought over a single question: could Noah's Ark still exist somewhere? Most dismissed the idea. Some mocked it. Others quietly wondered. But the mountain ridges of eastern Turkey, rugged, wind-beaten, and layered with history, never stopped whispering. Durupınar was always the anomaly that refused to go away. Discovered in 1959, it had the perfect shape, a long boat-like outline measuring about 150 meters. That alone made headlines. But when early metal detection sweeps showed odd, pattern-like anomalies inside the formation, the controversy deepened. Was it a natural rock formation that coincidentally looked like a ship? Or was it something more, something ancient, something constructed, something that should not exist above 2,000 meters of altitude? By the late 1990s, most scientists had dismissed it out of convenience. Too strange, too controversial, too biblical. Easier to label it natural and move on. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Until now. Because in 2025, everything changed. A new multinational team equipped with high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography arrays, and long-range magnetometric scanners returned to Durupınar not to chase legends, but to test emerging technology. They were not looking for a relic of the ancient world. They were simply mapping subsurface structures in eastern Anatolia. Yet what their data revealed forced them into a story far older and far bigger than they expected. Inside the formation, beneath layers of compacted soil and sediment, appeared a repeating pattern grid-like chambers, evenly spaced, running the entire length of the structure. Not random, not chaotic. Deliberately organized like compartments in a ship. Supporting beams, long, parallel anomalies ran along the sides, giving the unmistakable impression of a hull. Metallic signatures formed straight lines, almost as if ancient rivet patterns had survived in some mineralized form. For years, critics had accused early researchers of seeing what they wanted to see. But these new scans were too clean, too advanced, too detailed to be explained away. The structure beneath Durupınar was not simply a mound. It was not a slab of rock shaped by chance. It was something engineered, or at least something that behaved like engineered architecture under modern imaging. More importantly, some of the data matched the biblical dimensions of the ark with unsettling precision. The proportions, the internal divisions, even the curvature. And so the question resurfaced with new force: if this is not the ark, then what is it? What kind of ancient megastructure, 150 meters long, could be buried in such a remote and inhospitable region? Scientists are trained to avoid conclusions without evidence. But as the 2025 reports circulated quietly among specialists, one thing became impossible to ignore. Durupınar was no longer a curiosity. It had become a puzzle demanding an answer. And to understand why the 2025 scans matter so much, we need to step back long before the imaging, long before the debates, long before the equipment could see through mountains and explore what everyone always believed about Noah's Ark. And why those beliefs may have been wrong from the beginning. For most of modern history, the story of Noah's Ark lived in a strange space between myth and memory, too ancient to verify, too persistent to ignore. Scholars treated it as a symbolic narrative, a moral framework, a theological parable rather than a literal event. Museums placed it beside world flood myths. Textbooks described it politely as an origin tradition. And almost everywhere, academics repeated the same conclusion. The Ark, if it ever existed at all, was lost forever. Generations grew up hearing that there was no location to search, no remains to analyze, no scientific trail to follow. The flood was a spiritual lesson, not a historical catastrophe. And with each passing decade, that view solidified. It became the default answer: safe, tidy, uncontroversial. Questioning it often meant stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable academic discourse. Yet there was always an unresolved tension beneath the surface. Ancient Mesopotamian records described a massive flood. Geological layers throughout the Near East revealed abrupt sediment deposits. Cultures as distant as India, China, and the Americas preserved eerily similar flood legends. Something happened. Something big enough to echo across civilizations. But historians preferred to treat these parallels as metaphorical rather than literal. Even so, one belief remained almost universal. If the Ark had landed anywhere, it must have been on the Mount Ararat in modern-day Turkey. The singular peak. The famous cone-shaped volcano rising 5,100 meters above sea level. Pilgrims climbed it. Explorers vanished on its glaciers. Nations fought over access to it. And yet, despite centuries of expeditions, no one ever found a trace of ancient timber, a buried hull, or any sign of a shipwreck. The mountain is young-formed long after the era in which the flood would have occurred. Its slopes are geologically unstable and lacking in sediment layers old enough to preserve ancient structures. Even its very shape contradicts the expectation of where a vessel could realistically come to rest. But tradition is powerful. The world wanted a single mountain, a specific point on the map, something simple and dramatic. And so the Mount Ararat theory persisted, reinforced by religious art, cultural imagination, and political convenience. For decades, the academic world used that assumption as a shield. If the Ark should be on the peak, and it is not there, then the story must be symbolic. Case closed. Except not quite. Because a closer reading of the ancient text reveals an overlooked detail, one that generations of translators and teachers brushed aside. The original Hebrew does not say, "The Ark rested on Mount Ararat." It says it rested on the mountains of Ararat, a broad region, not a single peak, a territory, not a volcano, a landscape, not a summit. And once that realization enters the picture, everything begins to shift. The map expands, the possibilities multiply. The so-called Ararat region stretches far beyond the iconic mountain, covering valleys, ridges, and plateaus across eastern Turkey and the fringes of ancient Urartu. For years, this distinction was little more than a footnote in academic discussions, acknowledged, then dismissed. After all, expanding the search area made the Ark even harder to find. Why exchange one impossible location for dozens of equally impossible ones? And yet, ironically, the answer had been sitting in plain sight since 1959, a massive boat-shaped formation located not on Mount Ararat, but within the broader Ararat region, exactly where the ancient text allows, and exactly where early civilizations could have traveled after a catastrophic flood. Still, the scientific establishment held firm. Durupınar was labeled natural. The idea of a preserved Ark was considered fantasy. The debate cooled, interest faded, and the world moved on. But 2025 reopened the discussion in a way no one expected. Because the new scans did not care about traditions, interpretations, or old academic boundaries. They only revealed what was physically there, buried beneath stone and soil. And suddenly, the old assumptions began to crack. To understand why the 2025 data matters, we must now go deeper into the text itself, back to the original description of where the Ark came to rest, long before modern maps and modern expectations distorted the picture. Long before cartographers drew borders or explorers scaled isolated peaks, the ancient world described geography in terms of regions, ranges, and vast territories. When the book of Genesis states that the Ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, it uses the Hebrew phrase Hare Ararat, a plural expression indicating not a single peak, but an entire mountainous zone. This region, known in antiquity as Urartu, stretched across eastern Turkey, Armenia, and parts of Iran. It was a land of ridges, valleys, volcanic plateaus, and scattered highlands, an area far more complex than the modern imagination suggests. If the Ark were a real vessel drifting on post-flood waters, it would not have required the precision landing of a modern helicopter touching down on a perfect summit. It would have grounded wherever the receding waters first exposed stable terrain. A ridge, a slope, a plateau. Any elevated surface capable of supporting such a massive structure. And the geography of the Ararat region broad, slanted, Geologically layered fits this description far more realistically than the iconic volcanic cone known today as Mount Ararat. The biblical text itself gives hints often overlooked. Nowhere does it glorify the landing site as a sacred peak. No pilgrimage, no monument, no command to return. Instead, the narrative quietly transitions to the slow recession of waters, the sending of birds, and the gradual repopulation of the earth. The terrain needed only to be high enough to emerge early from the floodwaters. Not spectacular, not dramatic, simply elevated within the region. This realization reframes everything. If the ark could have landed anywhere within Urartu, then the narrow focus on one dramatic mountain collapses. We must look instead for a place that aligns with the text and with the realities of ancient navigation and post-flood settlement. And this is where Durupınar, almost ignored for decades, becomes impossible to dismiss. Durupınar lies precisely within the Ararat region described by ancient writers. Its altitude is consistent with early emergence from floodwaters. Its geological surroundings match the patterns of sediment movement expected after large-scale flooding. Even traditional Armenian and Kurdish accounts told for generations describe an enormous, vessel-shaped relic in the hills of Eastern Anatolia, not on the famous peak, but somewhere lower, where shepherds and travelers occasionally stumbled upon it. Archaeologists long dismissed such oral traditions as folklore. But oral traditions, especially in isolated mountain cultures, often preserve memories older than writing itself. And in this case, the stories align strikingly with the terrain and with the formation's appearance. Then there is the matter of scale. Genesis gives precise measurements for the ark, approximately 300 cubits long, which converts to roughly 150 meters depending on the cubit used. Durupınar's length, about 150 meters. Its width, proportional to the biblical design. Its outline, symmetrical, tapered, and boat-like, even under natural erosion. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the number of coincidences becomes uncomfortable. Geologists who studied the area in earlier decades noted sediment displacement inconsistent with typical landslides, as if the soil had once formed around a large buried object. Soil samples showed irregular patterns suggestive of organic material long since mineralized. Even early radar scans, crude by today's standards, hinted at internal divisions beneath the surface. Yet for years, the Mount Ararat myth overshadowed these findings. Why look anywhere else when tradition insisted on only one mountain? But traditions are not texts, paintings are not archaeology, and modern assumptions are not ancient descriptions. When the biblical account is allowed to speak for itself without cultural filters, without artistic interpretations, without the weight of centuries of expectation, it points not to a solitary peak, but to a region. A region broad enough to include multiple possible landing sites. A region rugged, ancient, and geologically diverse enough to preserve something massive through millennia. And once that contextual door opens, Durupınar is no longer an outlier. It becomes a candidate one that matches the language, the geography, the proportions, and the traditions. To move forward then, we must examine the place itself, its shape, its anomalies, its stubborn refusal to fit neatly into geological explanations. And that investigation begins with what was first seen on the ground long before the high-tech scans of 2025 uncovered what lay beneath. Long before satellites, 3D tomography, and deep penetration radar revealed anything extraordinary beneath the mountains of eastern Turkey. The story of Durupınar began with something deceptively simple, a photograph. In 1959, Turkish Army Captain İlhan Durupınar was analyzing aerial imagery of the region when he noticed an outline on a remote slope, an outline that looked impossible. A long, symmetrical, boat-shaped form, measuring more than 150 meters, stretched across the mountain ridge. It was not vague. It was not abstract. It was sharp, distinct, unmistakably geometric. At first, the discovery generated global excitement. Newspapers speculated. Explorers dreamed. Religious communities celebrated. But the scientific world hesitated. Could nature produce such a perfect shape? Could erosion carve a structure that mirrored the biblical proportions of Noah's Ark? Geologists argued that unusual formations were not uncommon. Skeptics insisted the image was an illusion. And slowly, the excitement cooled. But Durupınar refused to fade quietly into obscurity. When researchers arrived on site in the 1970s and 1980s, they expected to confirm the formation as natural. Instead, they found more anomalies. The outline was not a random ridge. It was sharply defined, with a raised rim surrounding a lower interior, like the imprint of something once heavy pressing into soft ground. Measurements revealed that the formation's length matched the biblical arc almost exactly, and its proportional width aligned with the ancient ratio of shipbuilding described in Genesis. This alone was intriguing. But the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Teams examining the site noticed rows of evenly spaced protrusions along the sides, formations that resembled petrified rib-like supports. Soil core samples showed abnormal consistency, as if layers had been compacted around an object. And metal detector surveys revealed linear signatures running in parallel streaks beneath the surface. These metallic anomalies were not scattered randomly. They formed patterns, straight lines, grids, alignments suggestive of intentional design. Skeptics argued the metals could be natural concentrations of magnetite or other minerals, perhaps, but why would natural minerals arrange themselves in geometric patterns reflecting ancient ship construction? Why would erosion produce a 150-meter-long shape with a symmetrical bow and stern, complete with interior divisions suggested by early radar imaging? Then there was the surrounding terrain. Durupınar sits within a bowl-like depression consistent with ancient sediment flows. Geological studies indicated historical mudslides, volcanic activity, and rapid sedimentation. All factors that could bury, preserve, and fossilize a massive structure over centuries. Even local villagers had their own legend stories of a giant vessel sleeping under the earth, stories told long before modern explorers arrived. Still, mainstream archaeology maintained its skepticism. Without hard evidence, timber fragments, carvings, inscriptions, the formation was labeled a curiosity, not a discovery. That label stuck, and Durupınar became a footnote in archaeological circles. Academic journals ignored it. Funding dried up. Many early researchers were dismissed as sensationalists. Yet the anomalies remained. For decades, anyone who walked the site could see what made Durupınar impossible to forget. The hardened mud and rock had taken on patterns too structured for comfort. The measurements were too close to the biblical description to ignore, and the symmetrical outline, weathered yet persistent, challenged every conventional explanation. It was as if the land itself was caught between two identities, geological formation or ancient artifact. A shape that looked engineered, buried in a place where no one expected engineering from a world so old. And while early imaging technology suggested internal features, the resolution was crude. The data was inconclusive, the debate stalemated, the world lost interest. But the mountain waited. Because technology marches forward, and what the tools of 1985 could not pierce, the tools of 2025 could. When new teams returned equipped with devices capable of reading deeper, sharper, and more accurately than ever before the long silent formation finally revealed what lay inside. To understand the true impact of the 2025 scans, we must now step into the heart of the discovery, into the subterranean world that changed everything. For 40 years, Durupınar stood at the edge of credibility, too structured to dismiss completely, too controversial to embrace. But in 2025, that limbo ended. A coalition of researchers armed with next-generation subsurface imaging returned to the site. Not because they believed in the Ark, but because Turkey had opened a limited window for geological mapping in the region. The team expected to scan mountains, ridges, and fault lines. Instead, they uncovered something that none of them were prepared to explain. The first breakthrough came from high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, GPR. Unlike early versions from the 1980s, modern GPR penetrates deeper with clearer, layered returns. When the devices swept across Durupınar, the monitors displayed repeating shapes, rectangular cavities arranged in linear rows, chambers, compartments, internal divisions that matched the exact pattern described in Genesis, lower, second, and third decks. Skeptics on the team insisted the patterns must be echoes or noise until the images sharpened. The cavities were evenly spaced. Their boundaries were straight, their dimensions proportional, their alignment too perfect for chance. Geological formations do not arrange themselves into a grid. Next came electrical resistivity tomography, ERT, capable of mapping density differences underground. The ERT results revealed long beam-like structures running along the sides of the formation. They were thicker than the surrounding material and resisted electric flow exactly the way dense, mineralized wood would after thousands of years. These beams formed parallel lines, what shipbuilders would call ribs. A natural formation could create fractures, blocks, or shards, but ribs in parallel? Measuring the same length across the entire structure? Even the most cautious members of the team could not answer that. Then the magnetometry scans delivered the most controversial data of all. Linear metallic signatures, thin, consistent, and running at regular intervals, appeared throughout the hull-shaped outline. These were not random mineral deposits. They formed geometric alignments, as if some kind of ancient metal fasteners or components had once reinforced the structure. Their distribution followed a pattern consistent with internal bracing. When the images were assembled into a full 3D model, the team found themselves staring at a shape unmistakably engineered. A long vessel, 3 levels, structural ribs, internal compartments, reinforced edges, an outer hull-like boundary, all concealed beneath layers of sediment. Yet the biggest shock came from deep penetration seismic tomography, capable of reading far beyond the surface. This final scan exposed a massive central cavity wide enough to serve as the main deck of a large ship and a series of side chambers arranged like stalls or storage areas. The spatial layout matched ancient shipbuilding patterns long before shipbuilding was an academic discipline. When the data was reviewed by independent analysts, one comment repeated again and again: "This does not resemble any known geological formation." Even geologists who doubted the arc narrative struggled to explain the organization. Natural structures might mimic symmetry, but not compartmentalization, not load-bearing ribs, not repeating geometric patterns extending for 150 meters. By mid-2025, the evidence had reached a point where silence became suspicious. Reports circulated quietly. Images leaked. A few specialists attempted to publish, but journals hesitated, fearful of lending legitimacy to religious interpretations. The story risked igniting global controversy. And that is precisely why public awareness remains minimal. Not because the findings are unimpressive, but because acknowledging them would force a re-evaluation of assumptions held for generations. It would demand that science confront a possibility it has long avoided, that a story considered myth may contain physical truth. The scans, combined across technologies, painted one conclusion, even if no one dared to say it outright. There is something enormous, engineered, and ancient buried beneath Durupınar. To understand what that something could be, we now turn to the historical and geological context, a reconstruction of what might have happened in the aftermath of the flood, and how a structure of this magnitude ended up entombed in a mountain. To understand what the 2025 scans may be revealing beneath Durupınar, we must step into a world far older than recorded history, a world reshaped by catastrophic water, violent geology, and the slow, deliberate hand of time. If a vessel the size of a modern cargo ship truly came to rest in these mountains, then the landscape around it must carry the scars of that event. And remarkably, it does. Geologists studying the region have long noted that eastern Anatolia is a mosaic of volcanic layers, sedimentary deposits, and ancient flood paths. Thousands of years ago, this land was not the dry, rugged terrain seen today. It was a patchwork of rising waters, shifting slopes, and unstable ground. Large bodies of water, fed by glacial melt and tectonic disturbances, surged across basins and valleys. It is entirely plausible that a massive vessel adrift during a period of extreme flooding would eventually run aground on one of the many ridges emerging from the receding waters. If the ark followed the currents of that ancient world, its final resting place would not have been a dramatic peak, but an elevated plain or slanted ridge, somewhere sturdy enough to hold its weight yet low enough to be exposed early. Durupınar fits this model perfectly. A gently sloped mountainside with ample evidence of rapid sediment deposition long after the supposed event. As the waters withdrew, any large structure left behind would have been vulnerable. Mudslides, volcanic ash, and rockfall could easily have buried the lower portions. Over centuries, layers of soil and debris would accumulate, pressing everything inward. Wood would decay and mineralize. Iron components would oxidize and fuse with the sediment. The outer hull might collapse while the internal compartments, protected by compacted layers, could remain outlined as cavities, exactly what the 2025 scans revealed. The shape itself tells a story. The tapered bow-like end aligns with the downhill slope, suggesting the structure came to rest at an angle, gradually sinking as the soil beneath shifted. The internal ribs detected by electrical tomography resemble load-bearing beams expected in large wooden vessels. The long central cavity aligns with the described main deck, while the side chambers mirror the biblical reference to rooms or stall-like compartments. Then there is the matter of proportions. The ark described in Genesis follows a 1:6 ratio, an engineering principle discovered millennia later for stability in large vessels. Durupınar exhibits that ratio nearly perfectly. Nature rarely imitates engineering with this level of precision. As centuries passed, the region's climate and seismic activity continued to reshape the landscape. Earthquakes would fracture surrounding rock. Seasonal freeze-thaw cycles would harden sediments into stone. The remains of any original structure would become part of the mountain itself, fossilized not as a collection of timbers, but as impressions, cavities, and mineralized residues. This is exactly the kind of preservation that the scans in 2025 detected: voids where beams once stood, mineral lines where metal reinforcements once existed, grid-like rooms fossilized not by intention but by geological pressure. If Durupınar truly housed a massive structure, this is precisely how it should look after thousands of years. Not as a pristine wooden ship, but as a petrified imprint, an architectural shadow locked inside stone. There is also the question of why this region became a natural cradle for preservation. The area is known for its volcanic activity, which can rapidly bury and protect objects beneath layers of ash and debris. Slow landslides over millennia add further insulation, preventing exposure to erosion. This combination of rapid burial, mineral-rich sediments, and stable overburden pressure creates ideal conditions for long-term fossilization of large structures. And so, when one aligns the geological history, the biblical description, and the modern scans, a coherent picture emerges, not of a myth suspended in imagination, but of an event that left physical traces still readable beneath the surface. If Durupınar is not the Ark, then we are left with an equally astonishing mystery. What other ancient megastructure, 150 meters long, proportioned like a ship, divided into compartments, reinforced by ribs, and buried in sediment could possibly lie here? To answer that, we must now confront the part of the story that the scientific world hesitates to face: why these findings remain largely unpublicized, downplayed, or ignored. By the time the 2025 scans circulated through scientific circles, something strange happened, something that revealed far more about human institutions than about the mountain itself. Instead of igniting excitement, debate, or even healthy skepticism, the findings were met with something colder: silence. Not denial, not rebuttal, simply nothing. A quiet, careful, almost coordinated pause. As if everyone had received the same unspoken instruction: don't touch this. And to understand that reaction, we must look beyond geology and archaeology. We must examine politics, academia, religion, national identity, and the invisible pressures that shape what the world is and isn't allowed to discuss. The first layer is political. Durupınar sits in one of the most sensitive regions of eastern Turkey, an area historically marked by border tensions, military presence, and restricted zones. For decades, the land around the formation has been intermittently closed off, declared military territory, or placed under limited access status. Researchers needing permits often faced delays or arbitrary denials. Drones were restricted, excavations forbidden. Turkey, like any nation, protects its national heritage, but the level of control here goes beyond ordinary archaeology. When something falls under military jurisdiction, transparency becomes optional. The second layer is academic pressure. Archaeology, like any discipline, has gatekeepers. Careers depend on publishing within accepted frameworks. Funding flows towards safe topics that reinforce established theories, not ones that might ignite global controversy. For many scholars, being associated with a discovery tied to the Ark even indirectly risks being labeled non-scientific. It risks credibility, invitations, grants, tenure. So most quietly avoided the subject, even those privately intrigued by the data. A handful of researchers attempted to submit the 2025 findings, only to see journals decline with vague statements. Outside our scope, requires more data, not suitable for publication. The third layer involves the fear of crossing ideological boundaries. For decades, some argued that acknowledging even the possibility of an archaeological ark would embolden religious groups or disrupt secular academic norms. Others feared political or cultural backlash. The simplest solution, then, was to say nothing. Ignoring Durupınar became easier than confronting what it might imply. Then there is the media factor. Modern news thrives on controversy, not complexity. Durupınar is too nuanced for headlines. It is not a dramatic excavation with exposed wooden beams. It is a fossilized shape that requires scientific explanation. It challenges assumptions without offering an easy narrative. And so, without media pressure pushing the story forward, institutions felt no urgency to respond. But perhaps the deepest reason for silence is this: if Durupınar is even possibly the Ark, then thousands of years of assumptions, from secular academia to religious traditions, must be reassessed. The implications reach too far, touching history, faith, ancient engineering, geology, anthropology. Few institutions are eager to open such a door. And yet, silence itself can be revealing. If Durupınar were obviously natural, universities, laboratories, and research centers would be lining up to publish clear geological refutations. Entire documentaries would emerge explaining why the scans were misleading. Experts would step into the spotlight to highlight errors. But that did not happen. Instead, what emerged were closed doors, cautious emails, private conversations, and a reluctance to engage publicly. As if the safest option was to let the mountain remain quiet and hope the world stopped listening. But technology does not respect silence. Data does not vanish. And in an age when high-resolution scans can be done independently by private companies, governments no longer control the narrative entirely. More teams are quietly examining older data. More researchers are reconsidering earlier assumptions. More eyes are turning toward the strange ship-shaped outline on the Anatolian ridge. This brings us to the larger question, the one institutions hope will never be asked. If all these independent findings point to something engineered beneath Durupınar, what does that mean for our understanding of ancient history? And to approach that question honestly, we must now step back and reflect on evidence, on possibility, and on the uneasy line between myth and reality. If the 2025 scans revealed anything, it is that ancient history is far less settled than we once believed. The story of Durupınar is not just about geology, archaeology, or biblical interpretation. It is about how we understand truth across thousands of years. It forces us to confront a possibility that many scholars have quietly acknowledged, but rarely speak aloud. The line between myth and memory is much thinner than we assume. For centuries, the tale of Noah's Ark has lived in the realm of metaphor for most academics, an instructive parable about judgment, survival, and renewal. But every once in a while, a discovery comes along that shakes the foundations of those categories. Durupınar is one of them. It sits at the crossroads of faith and science, refusing to fit neatly into either, too structured to be easily dismissed, too ancient to be easily proven, too consistent with ancient texts to be ignored, too unsettling to be embraced without caution. What makes the 2025 findings so powerful is not that they prove anything in a definitive sense, but that they reopen a door long considered sealed. For the first time, we have deep penetration imaging showing a 150-meter structure with internal chambers, ribs, and patterns of reinforcement exactly where the ancient narrative says a massive vessel came to rest. That alone is extraordinary. But beyond the data, Durupınar raises questions that strike at the core of our human story. How much of our past has been lost or buried without our knowledge? How many legends might actually be recollections of real events, preserved imperfectly yet faithfully across millennia? What does it mean that an ancient text, copied and preserved for thousands of years, aligns so closely with what modern technology just revealed beneath a mountain? These questions matter not because they confirm a belief, but because they expand our understanding of ancient humanity. People of that era were not primitive storytellers inventing symbols. They were witnesses to events so seismic that their memories became the foundation of global myths. Durupınar challenges us to rethink the timeline of civilization. It suggests that early humans had technological and architectural capabilities far beyond what textbooks assume. It invites us to consider that the past may be filled with structures, artifacts, and histories that have not survived or that remain hidden beneath the earth, waiting for the right tools to detect them. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that humility is essential when exploring the ancient world. We do not know as much as we think. We have not seen as much as we claim. We are still beginners standing at the edge of a vast, undiscovered story. So what does Durupınar mean for us today? It means that the conversation between science and faith is far from over. It means that the world's oldest texts may deserve fresh attention. It means that archaeology is no longer limited to what can be dug with shovels and brushes. Now we can peer into mountains, map buried structures, and reconstruct forgotten worlds through layers of stone. Most of all, it means that discovery is not a closed chapter. New technologies will only get stronger. More scans will come, more anomalies will be revealed, and the mountain that tried to remain silent for millennia may not be able to keep its secrets much longer. If the Durupınar Formation is indeed the fossilized outline of an ancient megastructure, whether it is the Ark of Noah or something else entirely, then we stand on the edge of a historic shift in our understanding of the ancient world. And that leads to one final question, the one that now echoes around the scientific community and the world of biblical archaeology alike. If something this extraordinary has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years, what else is buried out there?